This is Emergent. I'm your host, Reed Summers, and I'm pleased to be here with you today with an exciting guest and an exciting topic to discuss. Today, Eric Zidek is joining me on the show. Eric is a good friend and has immense expertise in the world of finance, investments, and is going to help me debrief the 2024 Seoul conference that we both just attended. And then we're going to look at the issue of societal readiness for the disclosure of non-human intelligence and share with you our thoughts on, is society ready to know that a non-human intelligence is in the world and is interacting with humanity? If not, what are the key issues and what might be ways society can become more ready for that, the confirmation of such a contact in the future? And then toward the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of the world and also look into this issue of drone and UAS incursions that are currently taking place over the United Kingdom in the last 5 days. So the plan for today's episode, once again, we'll be debriefing the Seoul conference, and Eric and I will be moving through the key topics that stood out to us, maybe some of the deeper issues that we perceived in the room or in the discourse, any new insights, novel information that we might have heard ourselves, and then just look at the discourse itself on UAP. How is that evolving? And what did the Seoul conference show us about that? And then, as I said, we'll go into societal readiness, the state of the world, and then these incursions that are taking place over sensitive military installations in the UK. For those who are not aware, I'd like to just introduce you to the Seoul Foundation and look through the lineup of speakers. I think it was quite a stimulating lineup to look at before I flew down to San Francisco for the event. A lot of important topics, some amazing experts giving important insight up on stage. So we'll go through that together. But really quick, the Seoul Foundation, what is this organization? Well, the organization was founded by Gary Nolan, a Stanford professor of pathology, Peter Skafish, a PhD anthropologist, and David Grush, a high-ranking former military intelligence officer who came forward in 2023, in part at a congressional hearing that really blew open the door to this issue and took it to a new level of both public acknowledgement, but also academic and professional engagement in the issue, which before that time was really not happening to the same extent. So to my knowledge, these three individuals came together, founded the Seoul Foundation to examine the broad consequences and the future of science, technology, economy, politics, law, religion, and culture, that the acknowledgement of unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAP, and with that, a potential engagement with a non-human intelligence might have for society. And as I see it, Seoul is really focused on the research and policy side, hoping to become a leading scientific and intellectual and policy research center, and to provide cutting-edge scientific analysis of the issue that can involve broader swaths of society, as well as individuals in numerous professions, getting them engaged on the issue and building the credible research and data needed to do so. So kudos to Seoul. We've all benefited from their work over the past year. In case you missed it, last year was the first Seoul conference, and these are the presentations. They're all up online. Highly recommend each of them. The one on the far right, I recommend the most. And if you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to do so. Carl Nell's presentation at the 2023 Seoul conference. This year's conference, to my knowledge, was a bit different than last year's. I was not at last year's conference. It was an invitation-only conference again this year, but it was a much bigger audience, roughly 444 people, packing a very large auditorium at the Fort Mason Center in San Francisco. So again, much larger and much more diverse audience. There were people from really every industry, every academic specialty. There were medical doctors, government employees. The FBI was there, to my knowledge, and there were members of the community and the citizenry as well. And I enjoyed meeting many, many dozens of people. A lot of folks I wanted to meet there, I was able to meet. some fascinating conversations. So, and I know Eric, I'm sure, had the same. So we'll be going into that together. Here's an image of the onstage experience at this year's Seoul conference. Quite the power-packed 48 hours. And so, with that, I would like to invite Eric Zidek on the show. Eric is a seasoned finance and investment management leader with over 20 years' experience at top tier Fortune 500 companies, overseeing multi billion dollar investment portfolios and spearheading strategic investment initiatives. He currently serves as an investment principal at Pacific Gas and Electric, where he manages a $30 billion corporate investment program encompassing 13 trusts. And he is additionally involved in a number of startups on the frontier technology space. So, with that, welcome, Eric. Great to have you on Emergent.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. And I feel like we were just talking yesterday from the Seoul conference. So glad you
I
made it
know,
home okay
right?
with all the travels.
Yes, travels were good for you as well.
It was local, so it was
I was
actually
just going to
pretty
say,
easy for
yeah,
me.
you're lucky.
About an hour or
You're
so
local.
drive and
Yeah.
didn't have to travel from other side of the world, thankfully.
Yeah, and I know a lot did. There were a lot of international attendees. I did catch the red-eye flight out of San Francisco, and it was delayed over an hour and a half. So I got home at 3:30 in the morning. So I'm going to backtrack and say no. I did have some travel challenges.
Sure.
Um, yeah, but all good. So yeah, I look forward to this just kind of debrief and breakdown, and we can start by just overall impressions and insights. Does anything stand out to you a few days after getting home from the event?
Sure. I think it was one of those conferences where there wasn't anything necessarily focused purely on new information for disclosure. But I felt that this event was extremely well put together. There were a lot of diverse professionals from all kinds of different disciplines. And I think every aspect of the event was very well done. I think they did a great job just vetting some of the folks that have come in. And they really had in depth and sophisticated conversations that, really challenged how people think too, as well. A lot of the people that I had seen on podcasts and so forth, it was really great to meet these people in person and just to see the trajectory of where this is all going at the
Yeah.
current juncture.
Yeah, definitely. And then, Eric, I should back up a bit. Tell us a bit about your connection to the issue of UAP and how you got involved. I'm sure everyone would like to hear that.
Sure. I feel like I had a bit of a strange connection, and I think one key moment earlier on is when I saw the movie Fire in the Sky, which was about the Travis Walton abduction, at least the Hollywood version of that. And when I saw that when I was around 12 or 13, it really just had a profound impact on me. I had seen other similar films, for aliens, so to speak, but there was something about that that really drew me to the topic as well. There was another instance too where I was first made aware of some supposed crash retrieval program when I was in sixth grade. Somebody mentioned there was rumors. My dad at the time had a contract with the CIA, so I went and asked him, and he thought it was completely bogus. So I kind of left it there.
Hmm.
But other than that, I kind of had like a vacillating interest throughout the years. I would say 2017 came out like everybody else. I started getting more incrementally interested in the topic. But I would say about maybe 3 years ago, I felt like with the trajectory and the unprecedented legislation, there really was not a lot of talk in the institutional finance space. And just given all the facts and being a very data driven person, that really pushed me to get a lot more involved into this topic.
Yeah, great. I know a lot of folks got in 2017 or got in again, having been in it prior in their earlier life. But fascinating. And your father worked for the CIA, and by all accounts, the CIA might be the one three-letter acronym agency that's done the most to keep this under wraps. Not saying your dad was involved. I'm sure he wasn't, but the CIA is getting a lot of heat these days with the recent um, disclosures, Immaculate Constellation, other things like that coming out that suggest who might have been blocking certain tech, even biologic transfers out of the defense industry. So, yeah, we'll get into all that. But yeah, great to have you. And I share what you've shared with me, which is a sense of a calling, kind of out of nowhere, to climb in and bring what you can to this, and a sense that the world needs you. And We're creatures of this earth. When the tsunami approaches the shore, they run for the hills. We have an instinctual connection to what's happening on this planet. And if we are making some kind of interspecies contact with a non-human intelligence, I'm not surprised that a lot of people in waves, as disclosure produces those waves, are going to feel that pretty deeply. So, I know we resonated on that shared that shared that shared sense of experience. Well, great. I'm going to put up on screen here the speaker lineup, and we can just kind of peruse that for a moment. I know this caught my attention when I first saw it. So we have aviation safety and UAP with Ryan Graves and Leslie Kane, the whole of government UAP policy approach with Tim Gallaudet, and then Eric Davis, Kirk McConnell, and Peter Skafish took the stage in a very interesting and stirring panel conversation. I did not attend the talk by the General Secretary of the UAP Caucus of Japan myself. Maybe you did. And then into the afternoon, we had the relational and communicative problem of UAP. I have some interesting things I want to share with the audience from that talk. And then Alexander Wendt remotely from a remote gave a presentation on UAP and human security, a topic near and dear to my heart. So we can dive into that a bit. Jeffrey Kripal and Karen Austin on the archives of the impossible, and then religion and UAP. And the plenary session with Jacques Vallée did not happen because I believe Jacques Vallée was not feeling well or was not able to attend. And so another good friend, Mitch Randall, was called upon last minute to give a presentation of Project Skywatch, his initiative to enable citizens with the technology and the tracking tools to observe UAP and report UAP activity back to a central database. So Mitch is actually next episode's guest. So stay tuned for that. Be great. And then the next day seemed to go more into the potential, more in the afternoon, the potential opportunity, industry opportunity of the technology, which is a nettlesome issue we can get into. But we saw Avi Loeb, Gary Nolan, Beatrice Villarroel, and then two very interesting panels, one in the morning and then one to conclude the event with Carl Nell. And then also a quite what might have been a controversial presentation by James Beecham, a physicist, I believe, working on the CERN project. So that was definitely a stirring one in the room and raised some, not heckles, but hackles maybe is the right word. Some frustration, I would say, in the room. And I did not catch Eric Schrock or Rizwan Verk's presentations, but I found the panel discussion at the end to be extremely important between Carl Nell and Gary Nolan. So we'll get into that. Just to kind of get it out of the way, what was your impression, Eric, of the talk by the physicist Beecham? Did you attend that one?
I attended part of it, and so my understanding was he was coming more from a skeptical route, and folks that were maybe on the so-called experiencer side, perhaps felt that their experience was invalidated. And I think it was, good to have a diversity of opinion, but that one certainly stood out, and I could see how you know people from different perspectives might not look at things the same way too. And
Right.
I don't know if you had a similar reaction from some of the folks you were interacting with as well.
Yeah. Well, a number of folks I talked to just simply didn't think he should have given the talk he did. I
Right.
initially, there was a tone to it, and there was a sense of kind of academic gatekeeping to it for me, which is, mainstream science needs this issue. All of these speculations, I think he used the word, are unhelpful, or some of the assessments or conclusions people are making do not follow from the evidence, which I think is a valid argument. But yes, it did have a bit of an undervaluing tone to it on the experiencer side. And, you know, some two things really stood out to me. The first, I'm excited that people like that were able to speak at this conference. He was representing a whole slice of the academic community globally. and in a sense was bringing them into the room by being able to speak to the audience. So I think that was a very positive sign. And in the history of the UFO issue, getting mainstream scientists who have major careers on the line to come out and give a talk on UAP was a challenging one. And so that it happened in this way, I think, is very promising. On the other side, though, I think the issue of not only UAP as a as an event, as a potential contact event with a non-human intelligence is so advanced that to start at the very base, bottom level questioning of using the scientific method to say, well, we need data, we need to study this slowly over time in a very methodical way. All of this speculation, get out of the way. So let science have this. I think it's too late for that. I think the train's left the station. And so there was I was reflecting and feeling like I think what was being painted was a picture of somewhat of some degree of scientific irrelevance, at least in some fields of science, to the issue. Because as we saw later, Matt Pines made some great points about how there is this tension between the intelligence community's approach to this and the scientific communities. And I've myself talked a lot about how there's a response framework and an understanding framework, and everyone wants the understanding framework. We want to use the scientific method to analyze this to the hilt and slowly, methodically build up knowledge in ways that can be replicated by other scientists. And it's like on the other side of the spectrum, we've got a covert operating craft or force or entity operator in our world doing things we don't understand in ways we can't mitigate. So there is an urgency of response. And I thought Matt Pines brought a really great perspective on that issue. Well, great. I think a few other things that stood out that we can talk about. I know Ryan Graves talked about the flight safety issue, and the national security question came up, and I think it naturally does. And curious how that landed for you, because I know a lot of folks get their ire raised when they start hearing about risk or threat or national security, and I did feel the tension in the room around that.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of different perspectives on that, and I think just looking, it's understandable, I guess, from the lens that they're looking through. If there's something else in their airspace operating with impunity and it's potentially a flight safety risk, it's something that they have to do. If something's over some type of sensitive nuclear base, it's going to be considered some type of military threat. So within that lens, that's completely understandable. But at the same time, I think we have to consider the fact that some of this might be a bit more sophisticated. We don't necessarily know what the motive is. At least we don't in the public sphere as well. But so I do think it's important why we look at this from all different types of perspective. Besides that, and not really approach it with like a level of certainty.
Right. Right. Yeah, true. And Ryan told a few stories from the Americans for Safe Aerospace side of the coin, which is his organization. He relayed a story about a 737 flying out of Johannesburg that was approached by a UAP craft at 100 yards proximal to the aircraft, and he shared that in the military uh, aviation world, 500 feet is what they would call a tactical safety bubble. So, that this craft is buzzing a civilian airliner loaded with people in such a way, even if the UAP has the technology to avoid collision, the pilot may overreact, and that creates potentially a considerable flight safety risk. And there was some fascinating conversation about kind of the aerospace industry. And Ryan shared that some airlines have actually cease and desist orders in place over pilots who do not talk about the issues of UAP. It's that clamped down, and yet the pilots themselves, at least in the military world, are even talking about this in their pre-flight briefs, is what Ryan said. So it's in his estimate, 50% of military pilots have seen UAP on a flight mission, based on his analysis. And then a question came up from the floor, which I thought was kind of interesting. One is, maybe it can get published online, which airlines have rules in place to protect the psychological safety of their pilots and which do not, which have cease and desist orders on their speaking out and which do not. Maybe you choose to fly, maybe you choose to fly Frontier and not Spirit Air for that reason. Maybe that becomes another aspect of how civilian pressure can be applied on this issue. Well, great. And another thing that came up, data was discussed extensively. Gary Nolan used the phrase "data off the curve" as a problem, which is, I'm not a scientist, but as I understand it, it's data that does not comfortably fit within the plotted line that the preponderance of data suggests. It's off that curve. And I think that's a really key one. Is what's the outlier, and do we chase the outlier, and how much energy do we put behind it? And I know in the industry world, that might be a question in terms of investment. So yeah, any thoughts on the data side?
Yeah, that's a good question. It brings me to some of the stuff we'll get to the second day with regard to UAP and some of the investment technology. So for something that's, potentially beyond, our current physics, maybe some of this, like the five observables, inspires some type of VC to start looking at some type of moonshot too. But the timeline for that might be very long. There might be a huge development timeline to be able to actually actualize that too. So it takes a completely different approach.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and Gary Nolan talked about the virtuous cycle of discovery and innovation, getting that started, which I think, as I see it, that's good. I think it's problematic. I think the uh, the privatization of this technology and the profiting off of it is already well underway, right? And so, I know we want to get more people into that, but I think we have to suss out to what degree this has already become a divisive issue, whether in industry, whether geopolitically, in terms of military advantage. We just don't know how deep these NHI tech and science have penetrated our human technological world, our technosphere, as it's called. But I will just also point out that Carl Nell made a very strong point toward the end of the event, saying that materials will be the key to establishing the phenomenon in terms of proof. And so, it seemed to me like that was really a gateway to opening this up much more broadly to global awareness, the literal materials. And he brought forward this 6-part proposed pathway by which, and we get into the UAPDA, which I know you're very familiar with via your work with the UAP task force or support of it. But this thing of imminent domain, and given that you're in industry and you talk to investment professionals, I'm curious, how is that landing for them? This idea of government having imminent domain, such that they can require whoever has the tech and the biologics to prefer that over to government, and potentially sacrifice their access to it, maybe the intellectual property rights that they might feel like they have.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we'll back up a little bit. And so my current role is, oversight of the $30 billion program over at PG&E for their investment, which mostly comprises of their pension, 401k, and various other trusts. And so as part of the job, we outsource a lot of the day-to-day trading to 30 of these Wall Street banks and hedge funds and so forth. And I'll say just on the traditional brick and mortar finance, you're not really having a lot of discussion about this. I've seen a little bit of change where people are quietly talking behind the scenes, but by and large, I'm not seeing anything in terms of research. And I have quite a bit of access and so forth too, and being able to talk to people at conferences and so forth. So I do think the stigma is actually really strong about that. I think in terms
Mhm.
of the eminent domain, it's a lot of the talk where I've met certain legal people looking at that, including some people behind the scenes that help draft the legislation. It's definitely a point of contention, and there's really a lot of multifaceted aspects to it too. If you think of just like a Lockheed Martin that has allegedly has this type of material, the question becomes, well, how long have they had it? They misstate their company valuation. Do their competitors have access to this? And so there's just this whole Pandora's box of being able to untangle that. And then I think the issue is too, it's if they have this type of technology and they want to release that, well, what's really the best
Mhm.
mechanism? Is it going to be, a few Silicon Valley venture capitalists that will, monopolize it, or would it be, something else to, benefit the broader population? And then should there be a phased rollout too as well? So there's just quite a bit
Mhm.
of aspects to consider for that as well.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, I know there's a lot of excitement over this technology and imagination that we're going to gain zero emissions energy or free energy, universally available energy. It's going to fix our addiction to fossil fuels, address the climate crisis. One thing from Beecham's talk, he brought up this. I guess it's a rhetorical tool that when something does not follow from the data we have, and I thought that was valuable, and I think the UFO community needs to absorb that into its DNA, which is, we have what we have in the observational record. We have actually a lot of evidence across the spectrum of different types. It's just not what people might call hard proof, that is, undeniable in the hand, craft, body, etc. But there's a lot of evidence and indications available across the spectrum. Former government officials, former presidents have come on the record, former CIA directors, that there's a there, that UAP are real. And so, in light of that, I think we need to look really carefully at this matter of gaining technology, science, even, I know it's controversial to bring it up, but even alliances with non-human intelligence. And in fact, it did come up later in the conference, and I'll highlight the moments where it did. It was skirted heavily, but the phrase "dangerous knowledge" was used regarding ET tech, and I thought that was potentially an important one to consider before we all kind of become opportunistic and try to get our fingers in the pie. It's like, well, what's in this pie? And if these technologies have already created what a number, David Grush, Carl Nell, and others have stated as a secret arms race, that's alarming. That means this is way outside the purview of university science, technology, marketplace. It's in the bones of the defense apparatuses that are dictating many of the geopolitical events that are taking place right now. So I'd love to get your take on kind of what is the risk side of ET or NHI tech and science.
I think if you have these technological breakthroughs, there's probably the reason why, at least that they claim that they're not going to release that. So you've had things from coming out from Ross Coulthart saying, well, this is more dangerous than a nuclear weapon. So if there's some types of exotic propulsion technology, ZPE, maybe there's some unintended side effects with that. With the ZPE, there could be some type of uncontrolled blast, perhaps. And, I'm certainly not a physicist, but I think the question would be, is there a risk where, a rogue nation, a terrorist could get their hands on that and be just a huge risk to national security, where it's actually a really legitimate risk and we don't want people to have their hands on that as well. And I think that seems to be the narrative. Perhaps they're playing that a little bit more than they should, but I do think it's something that definitely needs to be considered. And I also think too, there's also the aspect of how disruptive is it? Is it um, at a point where the energy would completely displace oil and gas and so forth as well? And I think when I was on the Good Troubles show, I talked about a potential phased rollout if that was the case. And then I think one of the comments thought I was shilling for big oil and gas. But I think the best thing would be it would make traditional aspects obsolete. But I do think it makes sense to be thoughtful about it. And how
Mhm.
can you do that without causing a lot of job displacement and disruption if possible? So definitely two of those things. The national security side, and then what type of societal change with something like that would completely transform human civilization. So those are pretty major components to
Mhm.
consider.
Yeah, for sure. The international side is compelling to me, and I feel disclosure needs to get out of this country. It needs to go international and quick because we don't know what kind of unsanctioned interactions are taking place with state actors, non-state actors. What is NHI doing in our space? It's all about what we've done and what we think we're doing and who did wrong. But there is an operator in our world operating in an undisclosed, covert fashion. Who are they interacting with? Have deals been made? Has tech been gifted, transacted? We don't know. And so before we just kind of re-balkanize and say, okay, well, what can we do in our country? I think this needs to go international pretty fast. Um, we'll talk more about that on the societal implications side. I'd like to kind of sense into whether you found any dynamics at play in the event overall. I'll just share one here. I definitely felt a tension in the room between these two straw men, basically claiming each other as a straw man, which is the government is just pushing a threat narrative. And the other's like, the experiencer crowd is all woo. This thing of woo and threat narrative. I felt it in the space that there were a lot of experiencers at the event, whose experiences cannot yet be scientifically substantiated, and yet credible research can be done and has not yet been done. And on the other side is, nuts and bolts. That's just going to undermine the argumentation to get this into science and get more credible research and data collection done. So I just wanted to call that out, that I felt that tension in the room. There's kind of like experience on science or experiencer on scientist. And I'm not saying anyone's against anyone here, but yeah, I picked up on that. Anything for you that stood out?
Yeah, that's great. And going back to, one of my earlier comments, just with some, exercising some epistemic humility. So I think it's easy to be in your domain of expertise and look at something through a myopic lens, even in the sense of finance. And that just happens to be, really the small place where I might be able to contribute to things. But the issue just spans much broader than that. You have philosophical implications, religious implications, societal, business, scientific, and all of those are inextricably linked. And there's a lot of nuance as well. So it's easy to categorize some of these things and, just these fixed types of positions. But the reality is there's a bit of truth to all of that too. I think just, from the where I come from the traditional finance aspects, you had Alex Klokas and Carl Nell earlier this year speak at the SALT conference. And I think it makes sense where you might start with the nuts and bolts, talk about Nell's credibility, and then, build from there because, something else might be too untenable to really, go to the other side too fast. I think anybody who's been into this topic for a while, there's obviously a lot more mysterious and things related not to nuts and bolts aspects. And, certainly those
Mhm.
are data points that I think we definitely need to consider,
Yeah.
especially when you have these consistent narratives and so forth. So if we're at the point where the government says, yes, the UAPs are real, you're having inspector general complaints, and you have Congress really pushing forward, second year in a row with everything going on. I think the question is, well, why can you decouple, some of these experiencer sides to that? So to me, I don't think you can do that. And those are the conversations I think we need to have. And, I don't claim
Mhm.
to know exactly what those experiences are, but I do know, some of these people personally. And, certainly there is not any mental illness. They have nothing to gain for that. And, they've been gaslighted likely just from, you know, people probably not understanding their situation. So the question is, have they been gaslighted for, 8 decades or so? And, I think that is a scenario people need to consider and look at that as a data point.
Yeah, good points. And I'm finding it kind of like the default that yes, the experiencer side matters, but it comes last, right? We need to start with the materials, the nuts and bolts, substantiate from there. And I get that. But I would say when you're decoding the intent of another entity, the entity encounter, the NHI human intelligence NHI connection, that's where you start with, and that's frontline because that's showing you the behavior of the entity with regards to single human beings. What do they do with people? For example, in the abduction phenomenon, which I personally believe is real. I think that is something is happening there with a non-human entity. And so to say, oh, we'll get to that at the end, it's like, well, you need to be able to assess intent early on in the process to formulate or articulate some kind of intelligent human response to this. I mean, we're 80 years in. Have we made any coherent species response to this event? I don't think we have. And I found to revisit it. Matt Pines came on to talk about standards of evidence, which was a great talk with he and Gary Nolan. And he talked about how UAP is kind of refracted, is the word he used, through the intelligence and scientific lenses. And in the intelligence side, there's this issue of acute uncertainty, time pressure. Like you need to scramble a jet, like is happening right now in the UK with these anomalous UAS drone incursions. You don't have time to go, you know, watch them for, I don't know, a year or two and see if you can scrape a little bit of metal off the hull and study the metal. And you have to respond. And I would argue humanity and government and the citizenry needs to be prepared to respond And so long as that is not happening, societal readiness sits at zero, you might say. And so, Matt Pines used this thing that, in the intelligence world, it's not about building a tower of knowledge. And in the science side of the event, I heard the phrase, "We need a modern scientific understanding of UAP." And I heard someone proposing a 20-year research project when they said that. I felt it from them. And so it's like there are these two tensions in the room about understanding and response. And I thought it was fascinating to witness.
Yeah,
And
and I
yeah.
think it gets back to your point of, looking at things in a specific lens, and we really do need that scientific approach, and not to look at things with undue, credulity. But the fact is that there's just a multitude of different people that had these consistent narratives, and so I think it behooves us not to ignore that. Similarly, I was looking at like an old John Mack presentation. So, the Harvard psychiatrist that would, or psychologist that would look at, some of the abduction phenomenon. And, he was making similar presentations showing, well, some folks can believe in UAP and the nuts and bolts, but, the abduction thing, I just can't stomach that. Well,
Mhm.
I think it's that kind of aspect that just says, I just don't want to believe it, therefore it's not there, rather than, okay, well, let's check. Maybe there's something more sophisticated happening and that we don't fully understand and that we should check because, you can dismiss the credibility of certain people, but when you have, a consistent narrative and it keeps happening, I think it suggests that, there's
Mhm.
definitely should be avenues to do that. And look further
Yeah.
into that too. And then, just really going back to the hearing with Nancy Mace, where they were compensating some people because they had injuries from UAP. So there's obviously been some type of interaction. That's a different type of interaction. But just getting
Right.
back just to the main point.
Right. I mean, if you can be injured by one of these things, it must exist. So,
Exactly.
I mean, to put the direct human impact on the backside of the analysis, I don't think is the right one. If you're wanting to respond in a timely fashion to this, yeah. Here's a direct quote from Gary Nolan. Don't be afraid to believe what you think is true, but don't think everything you think is true. So that's kind of how he left it. And Peter Skafish brought up this idea of social trust as a basis for talking about experiencer reports. And I think it is alarming in the experiencer community how their eyewitness testimony is not considered evidence or even data. And we're going to get into the evidence data thing because Gary Nolan had a great piece on the difference between the two and how not to get pigeonholed into there's no evidence as a rebuke. But yeah, I mean, where's the social trust? I mean, the people are having these experiences not all under hypnotic regression. That's not the only way that they're perceiving or remembering what happened to them. Some of it is direct conscious recall. And so, if thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands, we don't know, right, have had these experiences, and it's still relegated to a low trust, low viability, low credibility collective statement, that's a problem. We're gaslighting ourselves collectively in that sense. And one of my arguments is if you assess early on that there's a direct interface physically with individuals, and if that is non-consensual and outside the purview of law enforcement or the people who are supposed to protect the public, you go get the data to substantiate whether that's true or not. And the data has not been gathered and analyzed in the way it had to needed to be over many years. And so this thing of data, well, let's go get the data we need to substantiate the assessment we might make to respond to the event taking place. I think some things are out of order in the thinking there. Um, the last kind of interesting dynamic, I see this all the time in my work, is we need to understand the entirety of what's going on, and other people are like, we need to understand some of what's going on in order to inform policy and response. And there was this great this statement was made. I don't know who said this on stage, but somebody did. One of the speakers. This is Jacques Vallée to Carl Nell saying, "Well, we need to account for the whole phenomenon." And Nell reportedly said, yes, but to get the hill and the government to do something, we have to start somewhere. And so this kind of like everything versus something, or the phenomenon versus all phenomena. And I would argue, the physical, well substantiated physical nature of both craft and entity controller demands our attention. Like let's rule that in or rule it out instead of trying to rule the entirety of the universe's the findings of the universe that this phenomena might give us. Ultimately, rule all of that in. So, yeah, interesting to see those dynamics at play. I
Yeah,
want to,
some of the
yeah,
stuff
please
is
go ahead.
very, very confounding. Going back to Kirk McConnell, where so this was another standout moment where he was in receipt of a lot of like firsthand whistleblower testimony. And I remember one of the questions from the audience is, "Well, what probability would you put that this is true?" And so he was very candid, forthright, and goes up to 98%. And
Mhm.
so basically virtual certainty, and just admitting that he hears a lot of different stories and things that are frankly hard to believe. I think there were things maybe 2 to 3 years ago that are hard to believe, and still hard to believe on face value for me now. But I
Mhm.
think the trajectory where things are going, it's being able to exercise some of that epistemic humility and realize, well, maybe there's something else going on that we should consider, instead of shutting down at a certain step.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm curious, did you hear anything that you did not know before that was truly new or kind of felt game changing to you in any way?
I think just the clarity when Eric Davis and Kirk McConnell were there. So I think it
Mm.
just substantiated their original claims. Eric Davis mentioned that he was talking to, certain corporate vice presidents, government officials, people in programs. And I think that quote was put online too as well. But he came off that it was basically irrefutable in his mind. And, this is somebody that's, very careful, very precise about things too. So, it's another person that's providing confidence as well to that. So,
Yeah.
just getting a little bit more clarity on some of the things that we knew from people. And then
Mhm.
McConnell just being very candid about some of the things that he heard about too. Some of the questions
Yeah.
they got were, well, was there some type of firefight between some type of private contractor and a government entity at some point? And McConnell said, we heard stories like that, and heard stories of maybe psi phenomena, but he said it may be hard to
Mhm.
believe, but that's what he's heard. So very,
Right.
very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I have some notes on what Eric Davis shared, and I think it's worth just relaying to the crowd out there. He talked about this thing called a Presidential Emergency Action Document, or PEDS, which is what keeps the special access programs controlled. And he said it very directly. It's never been briefed to Congress. It's never leaked. Um, that those sets of documents. I thought that was interesting. He also said, this is just relaying what was shared on stage. 1 to 2 members of the Gang of Eight have been briefed, but only about the phenomenon generally and not the details. And he said presidents are not trusted to be briefed. That is how it is viewed in the intel community. Not surprising. But then he went on to basically list out who has been briefed and who hasn't. I'll share that here. We can kind of riff off that. So, who's been briefed? Apparently, according to Eric Davis, Nixon, Reagan, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Bill Clinton, no, Bush Jr. to some extent, and Trump, yes, but not crash retrievals. So, just relay that.
Yeah, that was definitely very interesting. I don't know that he mentioned the elder Bush. Obviously he was director of the CIA, and that seemed,
Right,
kind of like a given. And we've
right.
heard some of these from research and so forth too. But just having that other data point to substantiate that, perhaps some of these presidents were thought of as temporary employees, and that's a very interesting notion of going back
Right.
to what kind of architecture did they have, where there's really no oversight of the you know those programs from that level.
Right. Yeah, I exactly. What is the architecture of this government if it's not clearly government for the people by the people? Yeah, at least on this issue, he said Eric Davis said that there are hundreds of waived, unacknowledged special access programs, um, and they only brief the president when he has a need to know specifically about presumably one or a few, and when they need his executive decision on such programs. And strangely, the next statement I believe was made is that there are corporate VPs who have been briefed or who have worked on it directly. So, this alarming revelation, I think it's out that these programs, whatever they've regained as in crash recoveries, whatever they've developed in terms of reverse engineered technologies, this is happening outside the purview of government in the corporate defense space. And the government is marching to their beat maybe as much as the in the reverse. And so, what is the true extent of these programs, what they've developed? Have there been direct interactions with NHI? Carl Nell brought up the question at the end of the event. I have it on screen. I'll share. I mean, it's an alarming reality, and it just made me wonder. Who's driving the bus? I mean, we'd all, these are so compartmentalized that even if you're the program manager for one, WooSap, you may not have any idea about the other 120 that are operating on commensurate levels. So it's like, who is driving this bus? I mean, is there a dozen people in the government who know the full extent of the event of an NHI presence in the world and the technologies that have been recovered and reverse engineered? Is it less than a dozen? So it's eyes wide open, I would say, with information like that.
Yeah, it's interesting when you hear rumors that maybe there's 50 or so senior executives that have, the full view of this situation, you know, behind the scenes as well. And, maybe
Yeah.
one comment on this as well is, what really brought me in, even if you narrow the lens and say this is some type of terrestrial reverse engineering program, there's this issue of using taxpayer dollars in such a way that Congress is really pushing for that. There's a lot of credibility coming out from the ICIG that there are these programs, and that's been made from I believe Burleson and other statements as well. So even
Yeah.
if you just for the sake of argument consider that these aren't NHI, this is still a problem to look at either way, and it's something that financial market participants need to absolutely look at for that type of risks. So either way, how
Right.
you cut it, this is definitely some type of problem. If it's some type of constitutional crisis, we need to be looking at that either way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the market side, I'm not a market specialist in any way, but I can imagine it is a crisis of implications in that markets are trying to always price and discount, valuations based on the future or what they can see about the future and the unknowns. And it's like, you want an unknown, you want unknown unknowns, right? Here you go. And so the potential for disruption is pretty high, I would imagine.
Yeah, especially when you consider something that might be of incalculable value, and you have some of these people on the investor calls just trying to do some type of discounted cash flow analysis. So, well, if you've been
Right.
kept from that, how do you handle that? When
Right.
that's brought to light.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the disclosure as the divider seems it has a lot of power in that direction. I know Lou Elizondo in some recent interviews brought up this analogy of the sandbox, that a toy has been deposited in a sandbox full of toddlers, and who gets to play with it? Whose toy is it? And I think I know what he's talking about. I think we all do. So it's this secret arms race for technologies of unknown origin. And what he, I think, suggests is the way through it is to let everyone play with it all at once, which I think is an interesting line of thinking. Um, my thinking, however, was I want to question the entity who dropped that screwdriver or that power drill in the sandbox full of 2-year-olds, because they might drop another one. And there's the potential of dangerous knowledge, dangerous technology inherent in this. Um, Even if it's not inherently dangerous, our tendency to divide over it is astronomical. So if you want to provoke another world war, well, here you go. I mean, this could set up the next hegemonic power globally, and so I'm sure it's seen that way by certain states out there. So I did want to also highlight Tim Gallaudet gave some updates on the global ocean and some efforts to map a chunk of the ocean floor larger than all 50 states under the Trump, I guess, former administration or forthcoming. I'm not sure, but that it's underway. He also resolved the SoCal undersea anomaly. Basically, that's not an alien base under the sea, FYI. Um, But he also shared a story how Kevin Day, who was on the Princeton USS Princeton the day that the Tic Tac incident was recorded, said to him that that day those objects going in and out of the water retreated to Catalina Island. And I know Tim Gallaudet asked on stage, well, what's that about? And it highlighted to me once again, based on early assessment, the oceans, that's task number one in my view. Like, we have to understand the scope of presence within the oceans. It's almost like there's a basement floor of our house, and no one has the key. No one can go down there, right? And so, who's operating in the basement of our world? That's quite a vulnerability as a species. We love our ocean, beautiful planet Earth, and yet it is a liability to have a space or a domain in which we have almost no penetration into and no ability to monitor within. And I met a bunch of folks at the event who are engaged in various tracking initiatives. Hope to get them on the show at some point, but basically to create a mesh network of sensors to track, among other things, UAP in the oceans. So I thought that was important.
Yeah, it's really great to see the conversation move into USOs and how much of the surface of the Earth is covered by oceans too, and in addition to having that being brought up to the hearing as well. And then get back to your other point with regard to that structure. I know there was a lot of things on X about that type of formation, but I mean I think it goes to show that at the same time you don't believe everything that you hear too, and so certainly you're exercising that critical thinking and accepting things as that well, certainly without being closed off.
Right. Yeah, I'm personally very reluctant to share video and photo on Twitter and things that I just see in a feed. How do I verify that? I'm not capable. I'm not credentialed to verify it. I'm not discounting it. Gary Nolan brought up this thing. Well, it was brought up by numerous people on AI. There's the adage, garbage in, garbage out, right? Collecting just junk data is not going to give you anything. Well, with AI, there is the potential of doing some deep pattern recognition and gaining insight, not just into the nature of the physical craft, the materials, et cetera, but the intent of the presumable controller, the shape of the craft, the temporal, geospatial. Carl Nell brought up those. What are those dimensions of UAP? Because if you can gain data on those movements, craft movements over time, geography, what age groups, ethnicities, genders tend to report direct encounters. It's all data. If I may diverge for a moment, I thought Gary Nolan did a great job of counseling the audience on how not to be pigeonholed into this place of there's no evidence. The debunker will say, well, there's just no hard evidence for NHI or for secret arms race or anything like that. And he made he presented this very well, to the best of my knowledge, not being a scientist, so forgive me, but basically there's data, right, of all kinds, and you don't discount it just because it's not hard or physical. If it's testimonial, eyewitness, if it's biological or biophysical, if it's an injury of some kind, if it's a sighting, it's visual, it's all data, right? And evidence is related to the hypothesis you make first. So if you're hypothesizing something, the question is, well, where's the evidence? Well, it's within a hypothesis that the data becomes evidence. And so if you ask the right question, are we observing anomalous phenomena? Well, there's massive evidence for that, right? Are we observing a global takeover? There's not, right? Different hypotheses. Not to say either of those is inaccurate or the other is, but it's just, framing the right question is really important. So I thought that was an important little lesson.
And then his what he I think continually says too is the distinguishing between data, evidence, and an actual conclusion. And his idea is presenting this to scientific community without having that conclusion as well. And I think you have a lot from the debunker side where if what is their standard of evidence, and if it's not like a physical thing or XYZ, then it's completely discounted.
Right.
And I don't think that helps further the conversation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's helpful to get out of this, this glass ceiling that's been kind of placed over the whole issue, which is there's just no evidence. Those who call for hard proof, I think that's a soft argument in my view, because those who have what you might call hard proof, or the craft or the bodies, Those are the people who have kept this secret for 80 years. So to say, well, that's what we need, and without that, there's nothing here, you're just re-empowering the same agents, the knowledge holders. You're just giving them more power and more ability to keep a lid on this. So, I think using the not just the data, well, it's all data, but I like to say evidence and indication. There are numerous indications something strange is going on in our world, and there are numerous indications of a direct contact with individual human beings. Is there data there? Good question. I hope people start looking for it. Is there evidence related to a hypothesis? I would say probably. But yeah, I think we've got to circumvent these walls that obfuscate the pursuit of this issue, and I think the call for hard proof is one of those.
Absolutely. It's interesting where I monitor the Wall Street Journal just for different types of response in the financial community. And, there's definitely been, a pretty positive change over time. But, you'll get the typical, why haven't these landed on the White House lawn, when you have the 1952 flap and so forth. But, it's that
Mhm.
cognitive inflexibility where something is shut off. And by virtue of that, then you're not going to look at all the numerous data that's there. So, I mean, we know for a fact from FOIA requests and so forth that national leadership was concerned about this problem since the late 40s. I mean, that is a fact. And,
Mhm.
there's a chain of custody for that. And there's a lot more other information. I mean, we have like electrical, optical, forward looking infrared, $50 million aircraft looking at these things and eyewitness testimony. So, I mean, between that and the numerous other things going
Yeah.
on with this being worldwide, it's like a lot of that I think tends not to be looked at because, it's a tough thing to handle.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, totally. There are these cognitive barriers that are internally reinforced and societally reinforced. And, I think breaking those down might be one of the key first steps, because if your paradigm does not allow you uh, I mean, if your paradigm does not allow for there to be non-human technology in the world, you could be staring at the evidence in your newsfeed daily, right? I mean, the president of the United States could come out and say it's so, and your paradigm inhibits the looking, because the looking would lead to probably the adoption of an assessment or a conclusion that something is happening, but your paradigm does not allow for it. So interesting.
Exactly. And I'll say as a finance person, looking at walls of numbers, being very data driven, you have to be, or, in the investment space, you're eventually not going to probably make the right decisions. And, some of these folks that are reading the Wall Street Journal, very should be sophisticated business people, that data is there. And for me, it's not trying to convince that, well, you should think X, Y, and Z or some of this woo. It's, there's data out there. You just have to look and be brave and take
Right.
that first step because it is
Right.
there.
I know, and I ask the question to folks a lot. What is your need to know? Because some people have no need to know, and so they won't know. You can throw the data in their face; they're still not going to know. And then there are those who have a high need to know. But then the next question is, what is your will to know? And I find, whenever I ask that question to an audience, there's kind of like a little bit of a collective sigh, like, "Ooh, I don't know if I want to know. I may need to, but I don't know if I want to." So I think we'll get into the societal readiness question here in a couple of minutes. I think that's really it. I mean, if the need's not there, if the will's not there, I mean, you can have a government official saying it's so, and people will find a way to call that a conspiracy or a deception or a psyop or whatever, or just to ignore it. And I mean, ignoring it is a very valid response that I think millions will have, regardless of what's disclosed. Eric, I wanted to, before we wrap up on Soul, just there's this change in the discourse that I've been seeing. I saw it in the hearing several weeks ago, where the hearing, was all about kind of the cover up and the defense contractors and the lack of oversight, whistleblower protection. And then the final definitive question, I believe, to the four witnesses was, what is non-human intelligence? Like, just each of you guys say it. What are we talking about here? And so it's kind of this shift from object to craft, craft to controller. And I heard it at Soul. Peter Skafish said it very, very distinctly. What I would call the UAP presence. I took note of that. That it's a presence, right? And so we're talking about kind of a collective force that suggests more than just single craft or objects that aren't even craft. And then a few other phrases that were said on stage by presenters. UAP as structured vehicles, that stood out, right? We're talking vehicles now. And then remote controllers or operators. And in addition, the phrase designer operator was used. And so this is where I think we're naturally moving from nuts and bolts to the realization that these are under intelligent control. So who's the controller? And I think we're all looking at that shift happening in the global public mind. And when the public interfaces with this issue, I always take note. I go watch all the news clips. I go watch the Daily Show and see what's said. And it's like aliens. That's the only word I ever hear. Maybe extraterrestrials. They don't say NHI. So you can try to kind of nuance this and be subtle in your thinking all you want. In the end, the public is like, "Oh, you're talking about aliens," and I felt it in the congressional hearing. They repeatedly asked, "Alien biologics? What are you trying to say here when you say NHI?" So I think we're seeing
I
a
think
shift.
the tough part with this phenomena in what you see is there's really no relative baseline for some of this to compare it against. It's kind of you're going back to some of these alleged DMT experiences where there's this homogenous aspect of looking at entities and being some type of hyperdimensional thing that people continually talk about, and so it just seems it's a lot more sophisticated than people realize. I think first getting into this, realizing it wasn't nuts and bolts, probably took maybe 2 to 3 years of a learning curve just to kind of get my handle on some
Mm-hmm.
of that. But obviously this other phenomena seems inextricably linked to it. And I admit I don't know what to make of it, and I'm not sure what's there or not, but it's certainly interesting data. And
Yeah.
you kind of go back to the FOIA documents, and the fact is that people were looking into remote viewing, which I don't really know much about, but it is very interesting. And then the conversation going, and maybe people being more brave in the scientific community, something like ORCH or R, where you have microtubules being the seat of consciousness, and maybe there's some type of quantum entanglement that facilitates some type of other type of connection. So people looking into things like that. So yeah, I do think the
Mhm.
conversation is definitely
Yeah.
definitely shifted more a lot lately.
Yeah. I just want to share. There's a few past statements I wrote down from some of the presenters. um, Leslie Kane asked right on stage, "Are NHI in control of things directly?" Okay, I mean that's a question. Gary Nolan asked, "Can you be accused of murdering an alien under human law? Can you patent something invented by an alien?" So I mean, we're naturally moving into this realization that there's an interface. That this is a an encounter with at least entities or possibly another civilization or multiple. And so, what happens when civilizations collide? Right. Well, the less technologically advanced rarely comes out on top. They often lose their culture. And this came out in the global security talk, which is there are a certain number of uncontacted tribes left in the world, not very many, and when those individuals leave their tribe and enter the big city, their culture's gone. In almost all cases. So this risk of cultural erasure, and I believe that speaker is writing a book called The Last Humans. The last humans, meaning not that they will die out, but that the last humans to know that we were isolated or that were we were the center of our universe, anthropocentrized views of the universe. So interesting. I think it's a natural movement out. It's gonna help us interface with the public when we start to just face the fact that we're encountering not just a technology of unknown origin, but entities of unknown origin. And the more we delay on dealing with that and keep the public, out of that loop, I think the ontological shock will only grow.
Yeah, and I think to your point where when I was on the Good Trouble show talking about black swans, if there's a small probability if this should exist, quite basically it was getting down to if this is all true, does the financial system have the scaffolding and the preparation to be able to withstand something like that? But then I think you have to expand that to other areas too. Is does society have the right mental infrastructure and so forth to be
Mhm.
cognitively positioned? And right now, I think you're having mixed messages with the Aero historical reports. and all of this pushback. So I think that's definitely slowing down the conversation. But it's, out of fairness, is people have to look through all that information, or thinking that there'll be like one single point of disclosure and
Right.
then it's done. But it's like, that's kind of the beginning. If all this is true, there's a tremendous amount of things that are going to have to be figured out, and probably figured out pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah. Truly. I mean, it all depends on what's disclosed and how it's disclosed, right? And so we'll talk about that in a minute here. I just wanted to end with this passage on screen. This was so Carl Nell in his last talk introduced these Hilbert problems. I'm not a mathematician, but to my knowledge, these are problems that were posited as math dilemmas or questions that were unanswerable. Some of them were faulty, or really can't be answered by the nature of how they were articulated. So I guess there was an idea to what are the Hilbert problems of UAP, right? What are the key questions that are the dilemmas at hand? And I definitely I've heard Carl before talk about how disclosing the nature of this event is not necessarily the job of government, right? It's really more of a societal challenge. And so here were all these questions on screen, like in a sense, like, hey, all you people in the audience, all you academics, and take these and run, please. Like, do not wait for the government to disclose the nature of this event to the whole planet. And so I thought that was good. This one stood out to me, and I'm sure it will to others here. This is question number 23. This is a direct quote. Have NHI been conducting public diplomacy or possibly covert societal manipulation via interaction with close observers? So that's quite a question. I think it's one to definitely investigate, especially now that we have a sense of, if there's hundreds of unacknowledged special access programs or thousands, what is the nature of the interaction that's taken place? And is there some form of societal manipulation being attempted? The psi side of the phenomenon is documented. It's becoming well known to be a definite side, and neurological control, emotional excitation or suppression of neurochemical, functionality in the human body. I mean, that's something there are indications of that in abduction research. So, I thought it was notable that question was asked. And at one point, I think somebody said on stage, that NHI will birth a new political science, an exopolitical science, you might call it. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I, some of these things just on face value, it's hard to assess. But I think if you come from the point that it's nuts and bolts, it's a national security issue, and you kind of go down the spectrum, it's saying, well, logically, maybe it is a question that you should ask too. And is there some type of control system hypothesis, like Delay says? Is there something more sophisticated
Right.
going on? And and certain things like that are perhaps pretty unsettling. But
Right.
I do think these are worthy things to look into, as fantastic as they sound, given all the information.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, with AI and AGI, on the cusp of AGI, it's and having leaked our species data set into space via radio transmission, you can imagine where our technological development could be intervened in and slightly shifted in ways that might be a good looking to another entity, but not good for human interests. And so, the vulnerabilities of our species in what might be first contact are just tremendous. And that's I personally teach an 8 capability process for interfacing with this, and one of them is caution. I think we should be cautious. Trust but verify. Possible foe until proven friend. This is just logic, in my view. And I know a lot of people would just say, "Oh, that's the fear. That's the threat narrative." It's like, it's that's the straw man. And it's frustrating to me, but um, I'd like to turn now, Eric, and look at societal readiness, part 2 here. How you doing for time?
I'm doing great.
You're doing good. Okay, great. I'll put this up on screen. I threw this on Twitter, informal poll, and I don't normally get an even distribution across all options in a multi-choice poll. This is interesting. How, to me, this kind of says we don't know, right? usually when I ask the UFO crowd something, it's all or nothing, or mostly all or nothing. And I'd like to, as we look at this together, go back to a moment in the Seoul conference itself back in 2023. Hal Puthoff spoke from the audience informally and relayed a story about a private conference he was invited to in the government, asking highly qualified people to work on the question of disclosure and societal readiness. So let's have a listen to this. It's just 4 minutes long.
I was contacted by a CEO of a think tank in Washington, D.C. This is back a couple of decades ago. He says, I want you to come and participate in a conference here in Washington. I said, well, frankly, I'm too busy. What's it about? He says, I can't tell you what it's about. But if you come and you participate, you will consider it later to be one of the most important conferences you ever been to. Well, since I had respect for him and knew his background and many things he's done, I did finally decide to come to this conference. And when I arrived, there were about, 15, 20 people. I recognized some of them from the military, from CIA, DIA, some businessmen, and so on. So I thought, well, this is quite an interesting group of people. And so to start the conference off, he said, this conference is about disclosing something to the American public. As a startup position, let's assume that there have been crash retrievals by Russia, China, and the United States. And the question is, can we bring this out to the public? And so I think I, and most of the people I knew, when you talked to them later, said, oh, this is really cool. I mean, this can really go someplace. So he said, okay, the strategy we're going to use is we're going to make a list of all the areas that you think would be affected by this. And then on each one, you're going to have to grade them on a scale from +9 to -9 as to the level of impact and whether it's positive or negative. Okay, so we started out by making lists. So we started out with the obvious things. Well, I mean, the stock market, maybe religions. Well, certainly politics would be affected. So we made a long list. I mean, it was really a long list. And by the time we got down to the bottom of the list, we were really in the weeds. Like, okay, if corporation A has access to retrieve materials that corporation B doesn't, then when this comes out, corporation B is going to sue corporation A, they're going to sue the government. This is really going to be a tough thing to kind of handle. So, okay. So anyway, we broke up into groups, each taking a certain number of the things that were in our list. Okay. And in my group, we added up the numbers, +9 to -9. And we ended up in the negative category, even though we were kind of positively disposed to the idea. So I thought, well, maybe that just has to do with the particular list that we got. So then I talked to other people that were on other lists and said, you know, we came to a negative number also. Well, make a long story short, it turned out that everybody going through these lists, there was a very sophisticated situation with complex computers and big screens and all that kind of stuff. It finally came down to the fact that the problem was there's so many areas to handle, and there was no way to handle them all at the same time. And so the final result was, therefore, the leader said, we're going to recommend that we don't go forward with this. And so those of us who were participating in this were pretty disappointed, thinking, we started thinking that, this would be a good thing to do. So anyway.
Yeah. So that definitely caught my attention. How do you What do you get listening to that, Eric?
Yeah, that was a really interesting one. I know we had an early preview to James Fox's The Program, and there was something similar said about that. So really excited for people to see that. I think it comes out in a few weeks. But I think if you look on the perspective of the gatekeepers, it's hard to think, really what is their incentive. You essentially allegedly have all these different three-letter agencies, and you have things stovepiped. So how do you really coordinate this huge bureaucratic quagmire? And it's probably something that's still going on right now too. The
Hmm.
incentive is, well, what would happen if you disclose first? I mean, does that expose all the military powers? Does that give China or Russia a leg up? So I mean, I think the reality, as much as we want the disclosure, it should happen, but I think we do have to have an appreciation that there's a lot of things behind the scenes that just really have to be faced, and there's just true national security things I think that need to be faced
Hmm.
too. And
Right.
perhaps it might be a point where they don't disclose until they're absolutely forced. But I do think it gives us just good insight and what the situation
Hmm.
is, and there's a lot of sophisticated variables to this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you might respect the notion of controlled disclosure, which is not a word I liked when I first heard it. I thought it was a poor choice of word, but I mean, I have respect for the nature of the disclose. And I don't hear many people ask, what is it that will be disclosed? Because that, of course, changes everything. Let me see here. And I think Hal Puthoff later said that that was not the first such conference to have happened. It was in a long running series, seemed to stretch back in decades. And I think it was later shared that that happened during the Bush Jr. administration. And per the story, it sounded like they were considering, is this viable? Can we do this? And they decided it is not. And I think at the end of Hal's story, he says, he was thanked for coming, and basically it was kind of like, yeah, I mean, this is what has been said many times, and it was the expected outcome of this conference. Um, so here we
We all
are.
love Hal, but hopefully he didn't hold back disclosure for us.
Right, right, yeah. Well, I mean, I respect the challenge, and I think we all know we need it. Society needs it. It's a question, do we need contact as a society to elevate ourselves out of this interspecies descent into internecine warfare and conflict and competition and environmental destruction? And do we need this literally ontologically for our survival as a species? I would say we do, and it's happening potentially, and that's a blessed coincidence, or not a coincidence, but I think we have to walk carefully into it. And let's talk about society itself. And I know it's a huge question to ask. Is society, which society, American society, global society, and ready for what? But I would say ready for the disclosure of a non-human intelligence. It's Carl Nell's statement. There's zero doubt that NHI is real, NHI is here, NHI is interacting with humanity. Is society ready for that? I know Gary Nolan said on this at the Soul conference. This is a quote. I wrote this down. I challenge this notion of hysteria. And so he talked about, most people are just concerned with putting bread on the table. And he kind of described it as a buffering system, which is that people are just too distracted and overwhelmed with everything else to possibly care. Um, I'm curious your thoughts on that, Eric. Like, what's the Geiger meter on the social mind after, for example, an executive presidential level, or in the president's circle, a disclosure of that kind?
Yeah, it's like, well, will we be ever ready? I don't know, but can we handle it? Yeah, I absolutely think we could do. I think a huge part of the population, realizes just with the amount of stars out there in the universe that it's not a stretch that there's other aliens, so to speak, out there. But when it comes
Hmm.
close to home, that's just a harder thing to stomach. Um,
Right.
I do think it's something that people can certainly handle overall. I think humans are resilient. I do challenge the hysteria aspect, and barring some type of really full scale asteroid impact, I don't think there's situations where the stock market just goes to zero.
Mm-hmm.
If there is some type of new energy source or propulsion, I mean, it takes time to replace infrastructure and so forth, and that takes capital, and that just doesn't happen overnight. And so, my baseline
Right.
scenario, and based on things I hear, I just don't see that happening. I mean, sure, would it cause some volatility? Absolutely, but I don't think it would, cause some type of collapse.
Right. Right. Yeah, Richard Dolan has surmised a possibility, which is that the acclimation is being undertaken so slow that people will acknowledge this as probably real, but it won't challenge them in terms of the citizen government contract. It won't keep them from going to work in the morning. It's kind of like the JFK assassination, right? It's like most people know something happened there, right? Either our government or the mob killed our president, and yet it doesn't disrupt society. Um, Little hauntingly that the JFK files come hand in hand with the UFO files. Apparently, we're getting some sign on that. So, but maybe there is an attempt at such a slow acclimation that it's just kind of it's in the psyche, but it doesn't have the signal strength to disrupt the person. Um, we will
And
see.
it may not just in terms of day-to-day life, but if there is some type of technological breakthrough and that starts proliferating, eventually you're going to be affected by that. So, you'll be affected by the change, or if there's some type of
Mhm.
context scenario, then you would be affected. But, there might be a delayed or prolonged state where, you can go about your daily life and, not really acknowledge it, barring those two different circumstances.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the choice of word NHI is possibly chosen for this reason that get people to acknowledge an NHI exists, right? And they already do. Angels, demons, deceased relatives. I joke that I live with an NHI. He's 2 years old, and then a toddler, right? So it's get people used to like, okay, there's lots of intelligences. We're interacting with them, okay, and then maybe save the harder stuff for step 2, 3, 4, 5. Um, Obviously, like I think cognitive readiness is hard to gauge. It's like life happens whether you're ready or not. No one's ready to be a parent, and then it happens to you. And somebody asked, well, I don't think society is prepared. And I asked them, well, does that mean society is not ready? Right? Preparation and readiness are not really the same thing. I don't think society has been effectively prepared. We might be a lot more ready than we think. I would like to hold out for to be positively surprised by the response of many. Um, and the cognitive in the individual gives rise to the social cognitive. The social bonds, kind of the mimetic, the meme, the spread of memes in society, and then of course that gives rise to collective action. And so I think starting at the level of the cognitive is really important in this. But where my alarm bells go up, it is the NHI tech, and I want to get your risk assessment, given that you stare at the data and the markets. We can do a thought experiment and run Carl Nell's 6-step imminent domain sequence, which he shared on stage. I didn't get all steps of it, but it's basically imagine the presidentially appointed review board comes into being, and they can, with imminent domain, require the defense contractors to give over the material and the biologics. I think he gave the scenario of they retain the intellectual property that had been established prior to imminent domain, but they lose access to the material, and yet they could get a grant from the government or compete to get access to it. Let's just like run this thought experiment. So let's say the forthcoming administration puts it in place and they start basically calling all offices, right? And there is stuff coming out of hangars, and there it is on the exam board, right? And CNN's got their camera on it. I mean, from a marketplace perspective, let's imagine it's metamaterial, it's exotic propulsion, it's edge science that just blows the lid off of our notions of physics. How would you say the market reacts to that and over time integrates that?
Yeah, I think on your first point, it's hard to think that they would release this without some really planned amnesty or transition in any case. And, it certainly could be a case of a white swan if they release this stuff a certain way and it leads to unprecedented innovation. I think there's aspects of, well, what's the danger level of this type of technology if we don't understand it? I think there's, potential. What are the national security implications of it? But then there also might be, even with that, some residual aspects of, that this was kept for a lot of years, and then like another subset that's really going to be pushing for that. And so you could simultaneously have this destabilizing aspect, maybe with the
Mhm.
aerospace industry, and maybe that leads to, fraud, tracing it to certain financial institutions. So you have like a multiplicity of certain things going there, but theory of, you can mitigate that to an extent, then there might be some breakthroughs. I think that could be fantastic. But
Mhm.
maybe that technology also, you know is looked at by, some geopolitical adversary, and years down the road that leads to a bad scenario. So it's being able to contain that potentially too. So
Right.
all speculation, of course, but I think
Yeah.
that there's just a lot of different variables. Just maybe backing up, for one thing, too, just being on the finance side of this, a lot of folks will say, "Well, what stock should I invest in?" And really, it's impossible to really say, just given the situation. And I think anyone that says, "Well, you should invest in this aerospace," at this juncture, I mean, I think it's irresponsible. It's more of just having the broader conversation, given the lack
Mhm.
of information,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
definitely having these thought exercises for sure too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as I heard it shared on stage, it sounded a little too clean cut and and Goldilocks for my ear. Especially when you go outside this country and you start to look at foreign adversaries. I mean, we already have out of control, transhumanism technologies, gene editing tech that's accessible in ways that are potentially hazardous. So for example, I mean, it may not all just be metal from a craft and that kind of nice and tidy. I mean, there could be something genetic about this set of disclosures. I heard it in the congressional hearing several weeks ago. Congresswoman Boebert brought forward. I know it sounded wild, right? But I'll take her on her word that word is coming to the Hill that there have been, I can't remember the exact wording, but genetic interventions or some kind of hybridization taking place. So, I mean, if that's the tech, right? If that technology gets out there, may already be out there. I mean, my goodness, now it's a fight to re-engineer the human species. Um, so it could be pretty wild on this side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going the route. If you look at Ray Kurzweil and nanobots, and really increasing human consciousness after a certain point too, and modifying humans, it definitely leads to something. What was interesting too? It reminded me, Carl Nell's presentation, where at one aspect he talked about human potential,
Hmm.
and it was interesting what maybe that was being alluded to. Perhaps that was, maybe like a tip of the hat to the remote viewing. I mean, it was left kind of vague, but it definitely stuck
Mm-hmm.
out when he mentioned healthcare as one of the, six domains of, things that could be affected. So, it's really tying back to the point you're making
Right.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. I know a slide. One of the slides in his talk from 2023 has the lines of effort. The Gantt chart of getting society ready. Worth relooking at that. Um, Carl Nell, this is a quote from the 2024 event. Technology of unknown origin is probably technology of unknown ramification. I would have to nod to that. And then he also brought up this kind of interesting rhetorical way of putting it. This is the special relativity to the general relativity of ethical implications. So special relativity focuses on the relationship between space and time for objects moving at a constant velocity, and then general relativity puts gravity on top of that, right? So it's like we're talking ethical implications. I mean, this takes it exponentially to a higher level of ethics. Um, and I hope those conversations are happening. They sure need to be. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Astronomical implications for
yeah,
all of these allegations.
yeah. Gary Nolan said, I appreciated this. Technology for the sake of technology is not innovation. And so, this is where I think our species has to look long and hard at its at its need for technology and its relation. It's really its relationship with technology, because if that's out of control, or we just need everything now, regardless of ethical implications or ontological or existential implications, we're putting ourselves in such a vulnerable position. We're basically saying whatever we can develop, we want it now, and I'm going to profit off of it, and I'm going to be the first. And I heard the word broligarchs for the first time at this event, which is funny. Which is the guys who run these tech companies that are reshaping the world and pushing for the technologizing of society beyond what we can manage or regulate. And it is alarming. And the presence of a highly technological force or stake in our world, as it might end up being, they might interface with that. Who knows? Maybe that's they wanted our society to take that track so that they could better interface with it, with their technology. To what extent has our species trajectory already been influenced by the presence of non-human intelligence? I think that question was on stage as well in terms of the ancient side, of NHI in the biblical, scriptural, ancient peoples. But also, we need to look at the last 100 years, post World War II. I mean, this is an unprecedented century that we've just lived, and guess who showed up right at the time when our technology was entering the atomic age, and mass communication. So I think this is the responsible and cautious angle I think we should take, versus just running open arms into the wild world of alien technologies.
Yeah, and I think just getting back to one of my earlier points is what mechanism can you bring these out so you don't have one or two disproportionate VCs taking control, having a certain
Right.
disproportionate amount of power pulling the strings, and so obviously there's a lot of problems with you know different power structures in the past, and so how do
Hmm.
you benefit society as a whole? So um,
Yeah.
I think those are thoughtful questions that absolutely need to be asked for things of this magnitude.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I heard multiple people say in passing at the event that, oh, so and so of that tech company, that big tech company, or that AI company, they're interested. They want info. They're getting in, and I'm thinking to myself, here we go, here we go. This is what humans do.
Yeah, in speaking to the Bay Area VC community, they're a lot more open than the bigger traditional finance and some of these exotic technologies. They're definitely open on all this coming out, and I think it's leading to inspiration. And I don't think there's anything wrong per se if you're trying to focus capital to develop technologies and so forth. So that's part of the system. But I do think
Right.
there's situations where it could be unfair. Just based on how the structure of how some of this comes out. The IP and going to
Hmm.
certain people and so forth. So I mean, those are things that need to be you know pretty thought after.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think geopolitically quite a lot these days, and I'm going to get into that on the show here in a few minutes. But we are closer to regional or global scale conflict than ever before since the end of the Cold War, right? And so we have to be thinking in that way. And if it's all America first, national security interests top line, I mean, there are other countries with national security interests, right, that are in diametrically opposed stances to our own. So, how this rolls in the next 12 months, I think will be really important. Does it go international? Does it become a human species event versus a military or specifically aerospace industry event? Do we put controversy on the entities that are in our space who have deposited this technology, possibly intentionally? And lest we make ourselves the enemies and we basically bicker over the scraps that have just dropped down from the sky above. I don't know if you remember the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, right? Which is this somebody throws an object out of an airplane and it lands in the desert, in Africa, and the tribesmen, they treat this like it's divine material, right? And little do they know what it really is. So I do get that sense that we're stuck on the surface of our world. We don't have the perspective of the outside looking in, and we're dealing with these scraps that have fallen into our human space potentially, and we're trying to figure out how to game this and get advantage, and I think there's a step back, which I definitely advocate, a pause, and to the extent that the public is doing that, I think that helps the government. I think a big, right in that statement by Hal, from that conference, if there's no way to manage the multitude of outcomes or inevitabilities that would stem from disclosing this to the public because of what society would do with it, then if that's the barrier, then I think to get society ready for it, is to basically prep the mind of the collective to think in ways that support the nature of the disclosure, that lower the pain threshold and allow government to confirm rather than disclose, and get the dialogue happening outside of government and in the international space. So,
yeah, I think that's great, and appreciate some of the many of the things you're doing as well. And at this trajectory, I think we're on a course where it's just going to have to come out either way. So in both those scenarios, I think it makes sense to do that.
yeah, good. Well, as we close up, Eric, is there anything on your mind in the next year for this effort around UAP disclosure, and what seems important to you, or might be a takeaway for those listening?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of organizations on the UAP forming. So actually, I don't support the UAPTF. I wish I did, but UAP Disclosure Fund. I have some friends doing that. One Fung and a lot
Yes.
of the guys. It's really really worthy cause for working with whistleblowers and for transparency. So I think just being aware of some of these different types of initiatives. There's a lot of these out there that need resources. And for the record,
Mhm.
just being on the finance side, this is by and large not a lucrative topic, and I have
Mhm.
pretty good visibility on this thing too. So just for the record of that, when you get some of these things out there, and I know that too because a lot of these places need resources and they're worthy
Right.
causes. So
Yeah.
just ground roots, things, getting involved, you know, if you're interested, and
Mhm.
just working as citizens and keep pushing forward. I do think it's absolutely making a difference.
Yeah. I mean, if the citizens are pushing upward, and government is trying to push downward, I mean, maybe we need to kind of meet halfway on this bridge. So I appreciate all your contributions, and the UAP Disclosure Fund, those folks over there, important work gaining whistleblower protection, and advocating for things that might be inevitably needed, like amnesty and reconciliation for those who have committed crimes, possibly out of what they thought were the best interests of the whole. We don't know. But yeah, it's a multi-pronged approach out there in the disclosure space. So a lot of good efforts to support going forward. Well, Eric, great to be with you here and chat with you on this fascinating event we just attended, and look forward to what comes next.
Really appreciate you having me on. So good to see you, man. I'll
Great, Eric. Yeah, good
talk
to
to you
see you
later.
too. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. And for those watching, we're going to post links to Eric's social media, his Twitter and his LinkedIn, in the chat of the live stream. So recommend following him and reaching out. And much appreciate his presence on the show here. In the last few minutes I just want to reflect on the state of the world, and the state of the disclosure effort going into the new year. I will be doing an episode on the future of disclosure in about a month's time. So I'll save a lot of, I have a lot, but I'll save much of that for then. But we are entering uncharted territory as a world, and we have multiple regional conflicts that are at risk of escalating. We have nuclear escalation right now. We have new mutual defense pacts being written up, for example, between Russia and North Korea. We have foreign soldiers on soil half the world away, and I think it's a concerning time. And again, caution and responsibility, two of the capabilities that I advocate that we employ in this space, and staying human centered, meaning acting in the best interest of our species, not casting that out, and basically um, landing on conclusions that do not follow. If I were to take the line from the Seoul Conference, that do not follow from the observational evidence and indications we have, which is to say, just believing that this visitation is going to heal the world, fix the energy crisis, they're better than us, they're more evolved. Clearly, their tech means better ethics and spiritual accomplishments, right? Right? Is that what tech does? No, that's not what tech does. So, we're leaping here, and I think we need to act cautiously. And there are so many vectors of potential entry or and potential manipulation that could be enacted in our world. We don't know if we don't collectively, we don't have all the evidence to say that that's happening, but it came up at the Seoul Conference. And so I've shared those passages with you, and I took note of those. We are looking at this interesting and alarming preponderance of drone incursions over military bases right now in the UK the last 5 days. And just put this on screen here. Again, I cannot verify these images, but if true, pretty unbelievable that there are UAS or UAP spherical objects and other structured objects doing, wild things right over military installations. There are jets in the sky, apparently, from those on the ground out there. There are mandates to operate with no lights at night, as if we're getting ready for some sort of a confrontation here. And I just want to point to this thing of the nuclear connection, because it's well established in the UFO phenomenon that these craft have a specific interest over nuclear sites, launch facilities. They have potentially tampered with those weapon systems. They have taken them out of launch sequence. They have put them into launch sequence. And I'll put this on screen here. Lo and behold, the base in the UK where these incursions are taking place is indeed potentially a nuclear armed facility for the United States. I'll leave this up on screen. But this base, the Lakenheath base, is seeing all sorts of these drone incursions that are quite alarming. And interestingly, back in 1956, that same base saw a very well documented UFO case that was included in the Air Force's Project Blue Book. And so once again, we see UFO, UAP over nuclear facilities. With the current escalation, what a fascinating pattern to look out for if there is an increase in UAP activity around nuclear sites as we get closer to a possible confrontation. There are some speculations out there as to what might take place if there's a confrontation. And I'll share this this video with you. This is Danny Sheehan on a podcast recently, and I'll play this and share some of my own thoughts.
They are on the very brink of actually instigating a potential intervention on the part of an extraterrestrial civilization in order to preserve the life-generating capacity of our planet. That's what's happening right now, and that's what's panicking them. So all of a sudden they've come forward saying, wait a second, that we think that we're on the brink of some potential intervention here. And if they intervene in an aggressive enough way to shut off our nuclear weapons capacities in both East and West, that's going to reveal their presence. And we aren't ready yet. We haven't really taken the steps that are necessary to prepare our people for the intervention of an extraterrestrial civilization like this. And so you see this thing happening right now, kind of this mysterious process going on of some element inside the national security state coming forward, with the either pretense or at least posture of being good guys all of a sudden.
That's right.
Of that they've seen the light. And that they think, I'm really feeling bad about, how secretive we've been.
Let's tell everyone.
The excesses, and so, but let's make it clear. We're not here talking about revealing everything. We're talking about revealing some things. And there's some other things that we just really can't reveal, but we can't tell you what those are.
I didn't have a chance with Eric to ask this question, but it's a compelling one, which is if the government chose not to disclose, out of all the reasons shared by Hal Puthoff in that clip, why is this happening now? What's the incentive? Eric himself asked that question. What incentivizes doing this? Has the risk reward ratio or equation changed? Is there less risk of societal disruption now than a decade ago? I personally can't see that many reasons for this being easier to do now than it was a decade ago. You have social media, you have the risk of unverified and false news spreading, and so the potential to do disclosure seems more remote than ever. Um, and so, why now? I would say I think there is something at work here, and that is that the NHI is at work. I would suggest there are really two cover ups. It's not just the government covering this up and the NHI are in this neutral position waiting for the evil government to get out of the way so they can rescue our species. That does not follow from the observations. And it's quite a wild leap. And good luck convincing, policymakers and the people who have to actually put themselves on the line to make concerted action on behalf of the public. Try convincing them of that. I think there are two cover ups. And that means there needs to be two disclosures. There's a government cover up and there's an NHI cover up of some kind. They have been covering their tracks. They evade detection. They operate in covert fashion. There is an interest, or at least the use of our oceans. They appear when they want to. They make mass demonstrations at certain times, and at other times they engage in highly covert activity. So, we have to ask the question: is NHI one of the actors on stage right now? Is it a variable in the equation that is compelling disclosure to happen? And I have heard statements made that might give indication that there is the risk of NHI catastrophic disclosure without participation and coordination of an NHI false disclosure. That's also a risk. There's the risk of an NHI retaliation for possible, what have you, crimes committed, deals gone sour in the past. We don't know. We don't know the dark history of the nature of the involvement and what's really transpired. So there could be these black swans out there, and that could be one of the factors that's compelling this right now. If there is a nuclear confrontation and UAP, let's just imagine, show up over that installation and impede the launch and reveal themselves and basically make a statement of purpose to say we are here to help. We've already saved millions of lives by disabling these nuclear warheads. What position would that put the human species in? Would we be able to verify those claims? Would we be able to mount some kind of unified response to that, or would we balkanize and divide and different sides take different sides? And, so I think there is risk right now. And at the least, it is mildly alarming that NHI are operating in the way they are in a world like the one that we have. If you were to go back to 1947, let's imagine that was the first craft ever to visit the Earth, at least in the modern era. I don't think that's true, but let's just imagine, think through a beneficial visitation. Like on human terms, how would that preferably have happened? Okay. Would they have gone to the United Nations that formed soon after World War II, or the League of Nations before? Would they have made a mass demonstration that required humanity to face this as a whole? It's a good thought experiment. What would a beneficial visitation look like? Because what we have is what we have. I'm not sure that matches what a beneficial visitation would probably be. So there are a lot of known unknowns, a lot of unknown unknowns. I definitely grant you that. But I just don't think we can assume that the government is purely acting in bad faith completely and is standing in the way of something that we want to have happen that may not in fact be happening. And here I have this this rhetorical device, you could call it, which is it's thinking long and thinking short. Thinking long, we need contact. I think it would be profoundly beneficial for our species. It could do amazing things for the world, and it's quite a direction for our species to move in. Talk about a vision. of a human species engaged in its ecosystem instead of in isolation from that ecosystem. But thinking short, we have to deal with what's here now. And in my mind, let's follow the data. Let's look at the observed activity of these craft and these potential entities in our space and make a logical assessment grounded in that observation. And let's be cautious and responsible. Let's anchor into our instinct, which we are increasingly divorced from. And let's use our human sensing here because, again, this is what I would call an entity encounter. And government can't mediate that encounter on behalf of the species necessarily. They have a part to play. But this is why I think there are multiple layers of disclosure. And to the extent that we make it all about government disclosure to the exclusion of everything else, I think we're setting up a bad dynamic of government bad, ET good. That's the presumption. And the people versus the powers and the institutions that do a lot of important work in the world. And, government is not a monolith. There are a lot of good people in these institutions, and we need our institutions. It took us thousands of years to develop the beginnings of something of a stable global civilization. And to see that just devolve and to throw that out as worthless and to imagine that we just need to sign on with some entity or force from beyond our world, I don't think that's a good response. So in my mind, the layers of disclosure, citizen disclosure, government disclosure, NHI disclosure, and then in addition, there's the potential that life in our ecosystem that is not visiting us now could disclose the ecosystem and the nature of the visitation. Call that exosystem or exopolitical disclosure. And I just think all four layers are needed. Societal readiness will be based upon calling for all four. Even if the NHI won't self-disclose, we need to still call for it and place controversy there because there is controversy there. Why aren't they disclosing? And to do so now after 80 years, how convenient with a nuclear escalation, for example, I would find that not necessarily a positive event and one that we would have to thoroughly verify. And it's a question. How do you verify the claim of a non-human intelligence? Whether that's the claim that they authored our species, that they created our religions, that they're here to provide beneficial technology to us. Even if they provide it, are there strings attached? Are there supply chain dilemmas? Can we maintain the technology? Will we become reliant on external powers? I mean, this is just logical thinking. This is not exotic argumentation here. This is just thinking with our full capabilities in hand. So as I look out on the world, I think this is all the more important. And I appreciate everyone here being, at the front lines with me, thinking through this and using these fundamental capabilities that we have as a species. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining me on Emergent. I encourage you, if you're not already, to get on my newsletter. I'm sending out weekly episode summaries, key concepts, further commentary on UFO, UAP events, and then key questions and topics for upcoming conversations. If you have any guest ideas or any feedback from me, I welcome it. info@reedsummers.com. And with that, everyone, welcome to the front lines of the phenomenon. It's been a pleasure, and I will see you in 2 weeks' time for another show in which we're going to be looking actually at the citizen disclosure layer and exploring some exciting new technologies that are coming online that can support that. So with that, I will say good night. Take care, and I'll see you next time.